The life story of Lamar P. Higgins is, in many ways, a classic American success story. He was born African American in small-town Alabama in the era of segregation. But before long, the winds of change in the form of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s would present opportunities to Lamar denied to previous generations. And Higgins proved to be the right man for the time, building his vision, talent, and hard work to turn opportunities into success and achievement. Higgins did not use his talent and growing influence just to enrich himself. Instead, he has worked for decades to create more opportunity for others, to promote diversity, unity, and understanding, and to make our state, our country, and in his role as a member of Troy University's Board of Trustees, our university, stronger and better than ever before. In his own words, this is the life story of Lamar P. Higgins.
My name is Lamar P. Higgins. I'm from Marbury, Alabama. Born in 1959, I serve as Vice President Pro Tem of the Board of Trustees of Troy University. I'm the last of 9 children, born to Jesse and Joe Higgins. My mother was a domestic. She worked in households, cleaned houses, and cooked and took care of families. My father was a railroad maintenance person, and he helped worked on the L&N Railroad throughout central Alabama. I grew up in a household with 2 older sisters, and my mother and my dad, because he worked on the railroad, he came home on Friday afternoons and then would leave again on Sunday. And so basically during the week, during the school, it was just my mother and my sisters and myself. When my dad was home, it was everything is in order, and because he had a limited time there, I got to watch him do things that I didn't really understand at the time, but just things like learning to work hard and staying with the project until it was completed. Well, my mom was, she was a caregiver, and she took care of our school activities. She also took care of people in the community. We were very involved in our church, and it was just an atmosphere, a family atmosphere, a God-fearing atmosphere. And she taught us to care for one another and look out for our neighbors, and to really, the concept of really loving and taking care of each other. There were about 12 families in the area that I grew up in, and I was the only boy in the community, so all of the other mothers adopted me, and so I would go from house to house and be well fed and given a lot of advice from a lot of wise women in the community. When I started elementary school, my first and second grade, the school system in Chilton County was one of the last counties in Alabama to integrate. So the first 4 years of my education was spent in a segregated school. The first and second grade were in one room. The teacher would sit in the middle of the room, and the first grade would be on one side, the second grade would be on the other side. So she would teach one class math, give them homework, teach the other class English, and come back and then teach the other class the math that she had continued, and then would do the other class the same way. Well, it was a chance to intermingle with people from other communities, because I was the only boy in the Marbury area. It brought me closer with boys from across the Chilton County area, so I got an assortment of young people and seeing young people that I didn't otherwise know, wouldn't have known. The happiest thing I remember is being in an atmosphere, a God-fearing atmosphere. We had devotion every morning, and we read scriptures and we prayed, and then we would go to class. And having that God-fearing and religious background in education helped me to understand that getting an education, how important that was, but not just for me, but for my community. My teachers taught me to work together with other people, and having those two classes in the room, even though it seems crowded, it created a camaraderie. And we knew each other, we knew their parents, and their brothers and sisters knew ours, so we were like a family. I don't know, I was just drawn to history because I could go home and get an encyclopedia and read about what I'd learned in school. We weren't allowed to take textbooks home then. And so my parents had borrowed an encyclopedia set from one of the families that they had worked on, had worked for. And I would use those encyclopedias and just go through them in the evenings and read the encyclopedias so I could know about events that had happened in the past. When schools integrated, so the 5th grade, I went to Marbury High School, and it was a totally different atmosphere. Marbury High School had columns, wide hallways, large classrooms. There were 30 people in a class. I felt like I'd gone to college. It was just an eye-opening experience. I remember when I was a small child, before I started school, I remember riding by Marbury High School, and I asked my mom, I said, "What's that?" She said, "That's the white people's school." And I said, "Well, Mom," I said, "why doesn't the white people's school look like our school?" Because it was a one-story flat roof building. And she says, "Well, son," she said, "that's segregation." And so when I got to Marbury High School, I felt like I'd accomplished something. And based on what I'd learned at my first 4 years in elementary school, it was a task that I was ready for. I'd studied hard, I was ready, because I didn't want to be that black student that didn't succeed at the white school. And so I worked hard, got up early. We got to take our textbooks home, so that was exciting to me. And because I didn't have anything else to do, I would read my textbooks way ahead of time, and I would be prepared for my classes. And the instructors were very helpful in providing information and answering questions when I needed it. And the other thing that impressed one of my teachers, she had a scripture on the bulletin board. So when I walked in, and she was talking to me, asking me who my parents were, and I looked up at the scripture and I recited it for her. And she said, "How do you know that?" And I said, "Well, we were taught that, and my mom and my dad teach me the Bible, so I know a lot of scriptures." So she called on me from time to time to do devotion or to bless the food, and so that gave me a sense of belonging in a place that I wouldn't otherwise feel at home. I remember when Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. We were sitting around the television, and the news story broke that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. And my mother started crying. And I had never seen my mother cry like that. And it just hurt me. And I got my encyclopedia, tried to find stuff about Martin Luther King, and I couldn't. And so she told me what a great man he was, and that he was trying to make things better for all people and to make a equality and justice for all. I enjoyed Troy because, number one, I got a scholarship. Got a George C. Wallace scholarship, leadership scholarship, because I was president of the student council and Beta Club and was active in other organizations. And I think that when I look at the black students that were here, most of them were here on those scholarships. So they were individuals who were already leaders in their respective areas. So we were bringing together a group of young people who were at the top of their class. And then to be joined by junior misses from across the country. So this was really a mecca and a growth opportunity for young people that a lot of people missed. Everybody wanted to go to Alabama or Auburn, but Troy was the place that was growing and was growing people. And that's why I'm glad I selected Troy University. And it brought a lot of different values and perspective from people so that you just didn't have one area completely dominating a culture or a thought process, and bringing all those people together helped to bring this student body together. And I think that's one of the greatest components of what I saw at Troy when I was a student. I got here in the fall of 1977. I remember driving on campus and seeing the columns in the buildings, and fortunately for me that I'd seen Marbury High School, it wasn't quite of a shock as it would have been coming from Verbena Junior High School. But my first class was in Smith Hall, and it was English 101 with Dorothy Adams. And I remember walking in and seeing how large the class was, and being a little intimidated, and staying after class, and Miss Adams asked me where I was from, and I told her I was from Marbury, and she knew where it was, and we started talking, and she immediately made me feel at home and made me feel at ease. So anytime I had a problem or had a question, I would stay after class. She'd gladly answer it. So it put me at ease here at Troy and made me feel at home. I would end up changing my major to economics and social science. But at the time, there was just, I guess, a burning desire for me to get into a different area, something I wasn't really familiar with. And I didn't know a lot of black business people. And so that drew my attention. And so I took some business classes and then decided to go into another direction. I came to campus as a part of the political system. Being involved in high school and youth legislature, I was primed and ready. I didn't want to come here and watch other people do things. I wanted to do something myself. So I ran for SGA because I had been SGA president at my high school. So I ran for the Senate and was elected from Alumni Hall, and got my start my freshman year. The next year I ran for Senator at Large, which I was the senator that represented the entire student body. Actually had people from youth legislature that I had met that had decided to go to Troy as well. So I knew people from across the state because I had participated in youth legislature in other programs. The SGA president, Keith Wells, resigned, and the vice president, who was Claire Fryer, became the SGA president. And that left the vacancy of the vice presidency open, and Claire Fryer appointed me because Claire is a senior, so she's not running. She encouraged me to run, and to be honest with you, I wasn't sure that I wanted to do it at first because she had been a female and been SGA president, and I talked it over with my mom and dad, and they said, well, do what you think is right, pray about it. And I did, and I came back and told Clara if she would endorse me, I would run, and she did. And it was a decision that I'm glad I made, and I'm proud of the fact that I had a support from a wide variety of campus organizations and individuals, and it was very obvious, since there was only 10% black, that only the black students would not elect me as SGA president. I ran against a well-known Greek candidate in a popular fraternity, and everybody expected him to win and to trounce me 90% to 10. but that didn't happen. Well, I did that by using the senators that I'd worked with when I was vice president. I went to campus organizations. I went to everything, and I worked with people if they had a problem. I tried to work it out. One of the things that I was most proud of as vice president was that we would pass resolutions and bills, but they would not be written down. There was no book that said what we passed last year. So I codified the resolutions that had been passed by the Senate so that each year there would be a record of every resolution that the Senate had passed. And people were impressed with that. And it was little things like that and making sure that the Senate was run smoothly, that they abided by parliamentary procedure. A lot of them just wanted to get up and talk, and I pretty much ran the Senate, as the Trop put it, with an iron fist. And people were in order. They sat in their respective places. They respected me, and I respected them. Dr. Long called me, and he said, I want you to come and speak to the band. He said, because you're going to win. You're going to be the SGA president. And so he called me down to the football field doing practice after they had practiced and let me speak to the band. And I knew a lot of those band members, and of course, my fraternity brother, Bobby Lawrence, helped me and worked the band. So they are very receptive and received me very well. During this time, a lot of people don't remember this, but Auburn had actually abolished their SGA. They had an election, and Bessie the cow was elected SGA president. So they abolished their SGA for a short period of time. So all across Alabama and across the country, there was a move to disenfranchise, what I would say, student governments. And so I wanted the SGA at Troy to be something that students would be proud of. I wanted to work on parking and work on used books to allow students to sell their books at the end of the semester when they finished the classes. And that wasn't being done. And so there are a lot of things that I listened to people, problems that they were having, and tried to talk to them to try to come up with a solution. And those were the things that I think attracted people to my campaign, and that's what helped me to win. When I was vice president and senator at large, I noticed one factor when it came to homecoming queen. There would be 32 girls running. So the homecoming queen would be elected sometimes by 100 votes. And the margin between the winner and the first and second runner-up may have only been 3 to 5 votes. And so I saw an opportunity to try to put in a pageant where these 32 girls would be trimmed down to 5 to 6 individuals, and then the student body would then select from those 6 individuals who would be the homecoming queen and who would be the court. And so that, in addition to providing some structure to the election, it gave the SGA some revenue because we charged a fee for those young ladies to run for homecoming queen. So that gave the SGA some revenue, but it also gave some structure to the election. And by providing that pageant and giving the student body an opportunity to then select who they wanted, it gave us a better opportunity to look at the full spectrum of the student body, so that there might be 2 Phi Mu's and 3 AKAs. And so the days of the Delta Chi's picking 2 girls and then they would decide they would all vote in a block. And so that was the way it had happened in the past. And so we changed that. Willie Tullis was the first black quarterback. And at the same time, shortly thereafter, Bobby Lawrence was selected as the first black drum major. And I was elected SGA president, and our first black homecoming queen, Kim Davis, was elected by the students. And so it was a banner year of change for Troy, and change for the better, and just an opportunity for people to see that that Troy could be something different. Well, it's funny, at the time, I don't think everybody put it together until homecoming. And to come to that homecoming game and see a black quarterback and see a black homecoming queen and crowned by a black SGA president, um, that was our reckoning moment. I had interned for Governor Fob James my junior year. And at the end of my junior year, they offered me a full-time position. And it was one of those things where it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for a young black guy from Marbury, Alabama, to work for the governor of Alabama. Nobody from Marbury had ever done that before. Nobody in my family had ever worked in state government before. So I prayed about it, and my only requirement from my parents was that I finish school, in which I just transferred to Troy, Montgomery, and got my degree there. And my job was to review the bills introduced by the legislature and those departments that had specialized legislation or legislation that might adversely affect them. They would notify me, and I would notify the governor's office, the cabinet members, that there was legislation that would adversely affect, say, the revenue department or the highway department or the Department of Education. And so I was the conduit between the cabinet heads, legislative staff, and the governor's office legislative staff. It was teaching me the legislative process, and I had fun. I got to work early. I stayed late, and I really loved the people that I work with. I got to meet people that would come full circle in my life, and it was a time that I was growing and learning, and an opportunity to do something that I'd never done before. I went from the governor's office to the State Department of Post-Secondary Education, and that was the department that was created to run the junior college system. And the first chancellor was Dr. Howard Gundy, a former president of the University of Alabama. Dr. Gundy took me under his wing because he had met me at a cabinet legislative meeting creating the post-secondary education department. And he was so impressed, he told me he wanted me to come to work for him. So I went to work for him and basically handled the legislative process. I handled EEO and sexual discrimination for the two-year college system under Dr. Gundy. Howell Heflin. Howell Heflin was, and I'll say, the best public elected official Alabama has ever had. He was kind. He was someone who made you feel at home. I remember when I went to work for him, I had an interview with his chief of staff in Washington and his chief of staff for the Alabama offices at a hotel in Birmingham. Senator Heflin sat on the sofa, and his chief of staff asked me questions about who I knew, the legislative process, and whether, just questions that you would ask a person that you would want to be interested in hiring. And at the conclusion of their questions, they looked over to the senator and they said, "Senator, do you have any questions you want to ask Lamar?" And the senator said, "Lamar," said, "who is your daddy and what does he do?" And I said, "Well, Mr. Heflin," I said, "my dad is Joe Nathan Higgins." And I said, "He's a retired railroad maintenance for the L&N Railroad." And I said, "He is a wonderful, hard-working father and a loving husband to my mother, and he's a great man." 3 years later, he met my dad, and he said, "Joe Nathan Higgins," he said, "you work for L&N Railroad, you just retired." I never mentioned that to him again. But 3 years later, he would remember my dad's name and what where he worked, what he did, and that impressed my mother and my father. I was actually located in Birmingham. I went to Washington from time to time on key issues, key votes that the senator would have, but the senator had a very good staff, a well-oiled staff, and you never knew how Howell Heflin would vote until he voted. They would unleash phone banks on him, and people would call. They would flood the lines, no, yay or nay, and he would never give any indication as to how he would vote. Even the staff didn't know until he cast that vote. But when he cast that vote, he had that ability to make you think, even if it was the opposite of what you thought. He made you think that he considered your side as well, but he thought that he did the right thing for the state of Alabama, and that's what made him a great public official. I moved from there to the U.S. Space and Rocket Center, and I got that job because a state representative threatened to withhold state funding to the U.S. Space and Rocket Center because of their lack of black employees. And so I was called to be their equal employment officer. And it's interesting that when I got to Huntsville, I realized that it wasn't so much a situation where somebody was excluding blacks, but black people just didn't feel comfortable coming to the Space Center. It wasn't inviting. And so I did some simple things like making job announcements on black radio and advertising in black newspapers, and sending announcements to churches, and having events on the campus at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center that would bring more blacks and more minorities in the area. And as a result of that, our applications increased. When our applications increased, our hiring increased. So I was able to make a difference in about a year. In fact, I was so successful, the chairman of the board called me in and he said, "Now, Lamar, you need to slow down because you're about to work yourself out of a job." But the community responded well, and I think I was able to bridge the black community with the Space and Rocket Center in Huntsville and make people feel more comfortable, and I think that was the success we had in Huntsville. Troy never left my life. When I was SGA President, I was a member of the Board of Trustees, and a gentleman by the name of Doug Hawkins took an interest in me. And the other thing that Doug Hawkins and I had in common was that he supported Fob James. And so when Fob James ran for governor, I was his campus coordinator here at Troy. And I convinced the Student Government Association, when I was then vice president, to have a straw poll. And they had a straw poll, and Fob James won. The administration wasn't very happy that Fob James had won, and so they didn't want to release the poll. So I went to Doug Hawkins and I said, "Look, Fob James has won this poll, the administration won't release it." And he said, "Well, I'll take care of that." So he just sent the polling information to the campaign. Doug Hawkins is repeatedly calling me and saying, "Where do you live? Where do you live? I want to get you on the Board of Trustees." Well, I just kind of laughed because I didn't think it was serious. And at this time, I'm in Huntsville, and he said, "I thought you were in Birmingham. I've got an opening in Birmingham." And when I moved then to Huntsville, a position later would open up, and Fob James was governor again, but this time he's a Republican. So Doug Hawkins goes to the Republican Fob James and says, "I want you to appoint Lamar Higgins to the Board of Trustees." And the governor, knowing, me and knowing Doug Hawkins went into a meeting, and I'm told this by several people, so it must be true, but at the end of the meeting, Doug Hawkins told Fob James, "I want you to appoint Lamar Higgins to the Board of Trustees, and I'm not leaving this office until you do it." So I got a call from the governor's office saying that I was being appointed to the Board of Trustees at Troy University. Either that or Fob wanted to get him out of the office. 37, 38 years old, and it was like coming home. I'd sat on the board as a student, and now I'm sitting as a full-fledged member. And I can tell you, I didn't know a lot about what I needed to do, but I can assure you that Doug Hawkins offered some very carefully constructed instructions on everything that I needed to do. And I was a good student, I think. And we worked well together. And the best thing about the Troy University board is that it's got great people on it who believe in the university and are not selfish and for any other reason but for doing the good of the advancement of Troy University. Well, when I got on the board, the two things that Doug Hawkins said to me: you got to go to graduation, you got to go to football games. And so Doug and I embarked on both. I didn't miss a graduation unless it was work or there was some emergency. And I started going to football games, and photography was a hobby for me. And so I said, Doug, I said, you know, sometimes I'd like to maybe go down and take some photos on the sidelines. And so he said, well, I can make that happen. So he got me a pass. And so I started taking photos. And then I noticed that a lot of these student athletes were individuals that may not necessarily go to the NFL. And this was, you know, this was their moment after high school that, you know, that they would remember. And so I started doing little photo albums for the seniors. And then that led to, after the film, the digital age, of course, I started shooting every ball game. And prior to this season, I only missed 2 ball games in 10 years. At the first board meeting, when it was Dr. Glenda Curry, the vice chancellor of the Montgomery campus, came and made a presentation about building a library on the campus. And at that time, Alabama was under the consent decree because of the segregation lawsuit. And that basically meant that Troy could not build the buildings, they could not teach certain programs unless Alabama A&M and Alabama State, the two historically black public college and universities in Alabama, agreed. And so Dr. Curry told me, she said, I got this plan. She said, we own the spot where Mrs. Parks was arrested. She said, I want to put something there. So we began to talk and discuss, and we ended up with the Rosa Parks Library and Museum. That was one of the most significant moments in my life as a member of the Board of Trustees, is being a part of getting Mrs. Rosa Parks to agree to allow us to build that building. And it wasn't an easy job, and thank goodness for the tenacity of Dr. Curry and other individuals, because, you know, Mrs. Parks didn't know anything about Troy University, so here is this university wanting to name a building after her. And at this time, Mrs. Parks had not received a lot of recognition. This was before the Presidential Medal of Honor. It was something that we had to convince her that we were sincere about. And the connection that brought us together was my church, the AME Church. And when I reminded them that she was a member of the same denomination that I was in, and we talked to her pastor, we talked to her attorney, and they began to warm up to us. And but it still took about 1.5 years. We went up, we met with her, we got good response, and then they stopped communicating with us. And so we had to go back and try to prod them again. And so our persistence paid off. It was amazing. It was just amazing. She was such a humble woman and very quiet. We went to dinner together several times, went to church with her, went to church. And I think she was just the person that people saw how she refused to give up her seat. She was just amazing. And I know I keep saying amazing, but That's how you felt in her presence. She didn't make you feel like she was somebody really special, but she made you feel like she cared and that she really wanted to do what was right. The groundbreaking was a different type of atmosphere because at that time she was in great health. She was smiling, and it was a great time. Uh, Shortly, about a year or so after the groundbreaking, she suffered a stroke. So when we opened the museum, she was actually in a wheelchair, and they rolled her in the door, and the first thing she saw was a bust of her, and she started crying and calling for her mother, and it was just a touching experience. Mrs. Parks was a member of the church that I'm a member of, and her memorial service, one of her memorial services, was held at St. Paul AME Church, and we were able to get the Troy University Gospel Choir to sing during the memorial service. And Dr. Jack Hawkins, our chancellor, brought greetings and spoke about Mrs. Parks and Troy University's relationship with her, um, along with uh, Jesse Jackson and Condoleezza Rice, Cicely Tyson, uh, uh, Martin Luther King III, just a litany of historical civil rights figures. And when I think about those young students being a part of history, singing at the funeral of the mother of the civil rights, and having Troy University being a part of that, that brings chills to me. We, along with Troy University and other stakeholders, decided we wanted to be a part of states that honor Mrs. Parks with a holiday. And we were able to convince the legislature to pass a bill naming December the 1st as Rosa Parks Day in Alabama, instead of it imposing a statewide holiday that would cost millions of dollars. Each city and county can decide whether or not they would like to give their employees off. But what we wanted to do was to move Mrs. Parks to a different perspective for Alabamians so that they would know what a kind and gentle woman she was and what courage it took for her to refuse to give up her seat in 1955, not because she was wrong, but because she knew that the law was wrong. In addition to that, in the last legislative session, we were able to pass a bill to put a statue of Mrs. Parks along with Helen Keller on the state capitol grounds. They would be the first women who would be located on the capitol grounds. Mrs. Parks would be the first African American statue to be located on the capitol ground. The one thing that I will say that I'm most proud of Troy is that they have continued to preserve the legacy of Mrs. Parks and the courageous woman that she was. And their support was crucial in passing the Rosa Parks Day bill. It was crucial in passing the Women's Tribute Statute Commission. And so I think Troy has done a good job of continuing to maintain that legacy, and I think Mrs. Parks would be proud. Well, when I think of leaders, I think of people who are not so much out front, but they're people who are looking after the values and the culture of the people that they seek to lead. And I think you can't force what you believe on someone, but you can discuss and learn from other people and then try to bring your perspective to them to make a change for the better. And I think that's one of the things that bothers me about the culture that we're in now. We're so self-motivated. We think that because the only thing that is right is what I think. The only religion that is right is my religion. The only concept that I have is what I believe. And we don't take into account that, people grow up differently. They grow up in different cities, in different cultures. Some people grow up hungry. And so we have to take those things into account. And I would hope that, we would move toward a country and a world that is more inclusive of other people and more responsible for knowing that the future, that our future is tied to us working together and not tied to us fighting each other. Troy University has been a part of my life for almost half of my life, almost 24 years. I've been either a student or on the Board of Trustees. And during that time, I've tried to remind the university to be inclusive. And the response has been good. It's been a little slower than I'd like, but it's moving. And I'm so proud of the students because after I was elected SGA President, we've had probably 6 African Americans, females, elected president of the Student Government Association, while Alabama and Auburn are just electing maybe their second or third. So the students get it, and I think what you continue to see is students from across the country and now across the world with our international students, different cultures coming together and realizing that we can do a lot more together than we can divided.